Hi, everybody. Go check out my friends at Sonic Science CBD. They're a full spectrum hemp based CBD manufacturer out of Renton, Washington that produce phytocannabinoid rich products using the entire hemp plant using pharmaceutical based CO2 extraction techniques. CBD, for those of you who don't know, is a non intoxicating remedy for chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia, and other inflammatory conditions. Sonic Science makes tinctures, topicals, flower products, and even pre workout, which is my personal favorite. Go check out their Facebook group, Sonic Science CBD, to learn more. Also, check out episode 8 of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast, in which I interview Sonic Science CBD CEO and founder Tim McDougall. All right, welcome to another episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. Back with me on the show for a part 2, I have my good friend Sam Tullman on. Sam, welcome back.
Hey, man. Hey, nice to be back. It's fun to be here too.
Absolutely. So on the last show, we talked a lot about kind of, your experience in Zen and getting into neuroscience. What I want to focus this show about, you recently started a job, basically working for, is it a psychologist?
He's a psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist, okay, but okay. And basically, if I understand correctly, you're sort of doing these brain maps, these EEG or quantified EEGs. So basically looking at brainwave activity of criminals who are basically on death row. Is that an accurate depiction of what you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I started about a year ago. Got brought on as the lead technician for it's kind of, we're working with also the specific organization is the PTSD Institute, but it's really run through forensic and clinical psychiatry here in Seattle. And the name of the psychiatrist that runs it is Dr. Richard Adler, who's a fairly respected psychiatrist in the forensic field. So basically that means in legal cases or in criminal cases. Yeah.
Right. So, and who is employing him, or who is contracting him to do this kind of work?
It's various things, but generally, actually to these patients. But most of the work that is because defense lawyers have contacted him to do some sort of assessments and testing on their clients to basically assess their mental aptitude. So it's another way of saying like reassessing their culpability, reassessing their level of fault in a legal matter. And generally, as you mentioned, it's maximum sentencing cases. So in places that have the death penalty, fortunately here in Washington, we don't have the death penalty, but in the couple I have been, they do have the death penalty, and some of these will be death penalty cases.
Okay. And I mean, I'm super curious as far as, because when we've, in each of our past experiences, when we do brain maps and, we're kind of, we see certain things and we're like, okay, this is like a signature, we call it like, a signature for, anxiety. We see a certain pattern that pops up, or with depression, that asymmetry, in the frontal lobes, right? As far as the alpha amplitude, I believe. But is there a signature for psychosis, or like I'm just so curious when you told me about this, like, is there a way that we can definitively say whether someone, sort of was acting on their own volition?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in there. So let me first start by saying, even like, for example, you mentioned there might be a quote unquote signature for different conditions that we know about. And actually, I'll put conditions in air quotes as well. Because, for example, when you say depression, right now, that's the diagnosis that unfortunately many people have. But actually, when you really think about it, depression is a symptom. And ideally, in a better world, we would be able to say, oh, here is actually maybe at a biological level, or at least at a more root level, what's going on that's causing you to feel depressed. Because depression is a symptom. And right now, we're basically, people can get diagnosed, at least by the DSM, if they have the depression symptom in a couple different areas of life. It's really that enlightening. I mean, it helps so that you can then maybe make certain prescriptions or undergo different treatments. But really, it's not that specific. So when you say there's certain signatures, it's complicated because, for example, with depression, yeah, you mentioned there's an alpha kind of amplitude asymmetry in alpha in the frontal part of the brain. That is one kind of marker. But there may be various different things that actually lead to the symptom of depression that cause somebody to be depressed. So that is one thing that you can see. And it's important for me to make that note as we kind of go into that conversation, because it doesn't necessarily work to say, oh, well, all depressed people should probably have this. It's more complicated than that, because as we were saying, depression is a really different symptom and a very unspecific diagnosis.
Yes, absolutely agreed. I mean, I almost view it as more so like a diagnosis of depression. I feel like I'll talk to some people and they'll almost tend to think of it as if it's like they have, uh, like the flu, like it as like something that it's like they have some kind of like infection or something that it's like, okay, it's there. Like maybe that's not even the best example, but I think people tend to think of it as something that's, um, if they get diagnosed with it, oh, that's just the way I am. Like that's just me.
Right.
I'm depressed. I'm anxious. Like whereas no, you're experiencing depression, you're experiencing anxiety, but based off what we know about the brain and its ability to change, you don't have to be experiencing those symptoms.
Absolutely. Well, and it's complex and difficult, because this morning, because I was kind of having a down morning, and this period of my life I've been having some down days, and I actually have at previous moments in my life, at previous periods in my life, struggled with depression. And this morning I was like not feeling so good, and that word popped up in my mind, and I was like, oh man, so interesting that I would go into a story of saying, wow, I regularly, like, it seems like maybe I'm feeling a little depressed. That's like, there's a lot packed into like saying that to myself. When in reality, it's like, oh yeah, for the past few weeks, like, seems like in the morning I have a little emotional dip. And actually later on, probably it'll come up. Even right now, I'm feeling fairly good. So yeah, it's tricky. Like it can very much define a person. And actually, there's just relevant to what you were saying earlier. There's what I really that I'd love to read from the book "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a famous psychiatrist. And it's right along with what you were just saying, of saying like people look at the word depression and the diagnosis depression the same way that they would look at other forms of bodily illness. So this is the quote. Psychiatry aspires to define mental illness as precisely as, for example, cancer of the pancreas or streptococcal infection of the lungs. However, given the complexity of the mind, we have not even close to precision. And this is like right in line with what you and I are talking about right now, which is, can you look at, for example, an EEG and say, it's clear. this is what's wrong. And we're getting closer. We're getting closer. So there's certain signatures, to use the word that you use, that are becoming more well known. And in my work with Dr. Adler, our focus is largely on fetal alcohol syndrome. So, and it helps to be that specific, because when you can be that specific, now you can look for very, very specific, nuanced, like repeatable data points that you can see from brain to brain, rather than saying major depressive disorder or something, which is, like we were just talking about, very unfortunately, like a loosely defined diagnosis that is more symptom based. But when we're looking at fetal alcohol syndrome, we can see some very, very specific areas in the medial prefrontal cortex that have kind of arrested development. So yes, the answer is yes, there are certain things that you can see, say, wow, that area of the brain is very significantly impacted. And what I would like to say is impacted in such a way that you can't necessarily, it's not that the person's all the time going to be a mess or going to do horrible things all the time, but maybe can't reliably be capable of healthy behavior. But maybe is not reliably capable of healthy behavior. That nervous system.
Interesting. So are those the cases that Dr. Adler, is that the cases he chooses to take on as people who are being, charged with some major crime, some maybe facing the death penalty in other states, but people who have a history of fetal alcohol syndrome? Is that?
Yeah, he's definitely he's an expert in fetal alcohol syndrome. So there's other cases that he and we take on. But that seems to be the sweet spot. And especially because there's now especially because of our work, a growing legal precedent in those types of cases. To be able to say, all right, look, we can clearly see there's a scientific precedent now. We've published papers that show, hey, this is a clear pattern here. So we can pretty much confirm that this person actually does have fetal alcohol syndrome. And there's also a lot of around, okay, people with fetal alcohol syndrome suffer from these things. And that holds up quite well in the court. So for that reason, that's a focus, and because he's an expert. But there are some other cases that we've worked on, yeah.
Okay. So just to play devil's advocate for a second. So obviously not everyone with fetal alcohol syndrome is going to go out and do a mass murder or rape, or so how even if two people have fetal alcohol syndrome, how do you say one, someone who acted in a way, maybe they didn't have complete control over their behavior, but how can you say that, they can I don't want to say use that as an excuse, because not to take anything away from that condition, but how can you say that that is what is causing, or that is what caused them to commit a certain crime?
Yeah. So I think maybe you look at it would be of risk. And like you said, like not every single person with fetal alcohol syndrome that's going to go out and commit some heinous crime. And so first of all, there might be differing levels of severity, of impact on the brain. And theoretically, I can't say with confidence, because we haven't published a paper on this and we haven't specifically studied differentiating it, although we have case-by-case basis seen this. But theoretically, there should be differing levels of impact on the brain, differing levels of severity that should be measurable in the same areas that we're measuring the impact in general on the brain. So that's the first thing, is we can see severity. And that severity, although, a jury is not going to be an expert in being able to say, oh, we know that, is different than the brains that we saw. But for example, when Dr. Adler is testifying, he can speak on that level of severity. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is when you look at risk factors. So fetal alcohol syndrome is one huge risk factor. But there's going to be a lot of other things too. There's going to be major environmental factors that are going to play a role. No matter what, a person with a significant, or recordable, diagnosable amount of fetal alcohol syndrome, they're going to have some behavioral effects. There's going to be some result that is going to be, unfortunately, unsavory on their behavior and on their experience in life. But there's a lot of other risk factors. So, like what they're exposed to within their home. And we can go down the list of various other risk factors that when you play it in, and that's how these cases work, it becomes a narrative. So you can, and not only the cases, but actually people's lives as well. So you have a life narrative, and that life narrative, when it becomes a downward spiral, then you have some more of these heinous crimes. And often in many of these cases, you have additional drug abuse or traumatic brain injury. So there's various other risk factors that play in that create a pretty clear picture of, okay, look, how could we rely on this person to have healthy behavior, and how can we fault them for not having healthy behavior?
Right. That's really interesting. Can you walk me through like the process? So say someone decides, or their family, I don't know how it works, but basically someone hires or gets Dr. Adler on the team. What is the whole process as far as, you guys do the brain map, you guys analyze the results. How does that then get translated to a judge and jury? And I'm curious as far as, have you actually been there when Dr. Adler is, do you actually go to the courtroom when he's testifying?
No, I don't. So here's the process. Generally, it's a public defender, and often these crimes are quite public. But the thing about these maximum sentencing cases is they also take some time. So generally, I'm not going in, for example, to take a recording immediately after it's happened. So what will often happen is a public defender will he may do some initial assessment, or some other psychiatrist has done some initial assessment. There's going to be a kind of looking over of all of the medical records, and then particularly, not only, but particularly if fetal alcohol syndrome is indicated, then they may send me in, or other conditions that we might be able to see more easily, more clearly on the QEEG. And then at some point, especially as trials are nearing, particularly, I will get sent in because it's much more valid if it's a recent or semi-recent recording. So often that's a good amount of time later. I'm not going in immediately after it's happened. I'll then take the recording. I may do some initial analysis and speak with Dr. Adler. The majority goes to one of two different PhDs that we work with who are experts in the field. Because I'm not a PhD, so it's quite important to have an expert level of analysis and testimony. So while I have a lot of experience, we're talking about what's going to hold up at the highest level of scrutiny in the court of law. So that then goes to somebody with a lot of experience at the PhD level that will do this analysis. He'll kind of have a conversation with Dr. Adler. They'll go back and forth about what they're seeing. And then that gets sent to, again, generally, the defense. And from there, when it comes time for the trial, Dr. Adler will almost always be called as a witness. And then he'll basically testify to what he's seen.
Okay. And is it always, he's always defending the person. Is that correct? Or is there ever a case where it's like, okay, we're
Mm,
actually not seeing the markers, so this person actually is liable for what they did? Or is he always playing the part of putting, defending someone?
it's so yeah, it's pretty much always going to be in a defense circumstance. That doesn't mean that he won't be questioned by the other side. Um, Certainly he is, but if we don't see results, so generally it's the defense that's made the inquiry into having this testing done. So if there's not a kind of uh, result that's going to be useful for the trial for them, then generally, uh, there's not. But
Right.
that's very rarely the case because, as you and I have talked about, uh, this whole mental health thing is generally connected to uh, like criminal behavior, and this whole mental health thing is also generally connected to what's going on in the electrical activity of the brain. So you're
Mhm.
generally seeing a correlation there, which Dr. Adler can speak to.
Right. I'm curious, so I don't know, obviously having me having never spoken to him, but I'm curious just from you, your motivation in doing this. I assume, and I think we've had a conversation previously where you've kind of told me about, sort of why you wanted to do this. Um, but I'm curious, can you just kind of explain, like, is there, like, do you feel um, that there are a lot of people that are kind of tied up in this criminal justice system who, really aren't, completely responsible for their crimes? Because the way I see it personally is it's sort of like, and I'm going to say something controversial, but as far as, when it comes to the, all the press coverage that's been going on with, the school shootings, it's like, people try to make it, oh, it's guns, it's this, it's that, but it's like, okay, it could be all, it probably is all of those factors, but how can you say that, like, someone like that, how can you say that they, like it's always a mental health issue to me? Like, me or you could not fathom ever going into a school and shooting a bunch of innocent kids. Like, our brains don't even function. Like, we would not only know that that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
horrible
I
to
mean,
do,
yeah.
but
People seem to be right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
even if we were deluded enough to think, I want to do this, we would probably think, like, our prefrontal cortex would step in and be like, well, it's probably not the best idea. It's probably not going to give me, the result. I'm, probably going to put me in jail or get me killed. Like, so is it something like that where do you see that? I mean, I guess the question I'll pose to you is, do you think that most people in the criminal justice system have some kind of mental illness, some kind of mental disorder that is kind of, you know, swaying their behavior in some way?
Without a doubt. And also, it doesn't need to just be, my opinion. Actually, there's research on this, that the majority of people that are like convicted of serious crimes do have various mental health conditions, often more than one. So we don't even need to go off my opinion on that one. And I agree with you that, I feel like there was a question that you asked earlier that I was going to get to, but we can just go for this one for now. Um, yeah, that people are kind of ignoring the elephant in the room. Now, certainly, I am definitely um, of the mind that gun control needs to be a serious issue that's talked about, right? Because even if you do uh, have somebody with mental health issues, well, if they can't get access to a weapon, then the damage that they can do is a lot decreased, and the loss of life is going to be decreased. So that seems to be one obvious angle to come at it from. But the other obvious angle is exactly what you said. It's a mental health issue. And perhaps there's various reasons that people don't talk about. One is realistic. Two is people don't know what to do about it. Like we're at a major loss with what to do regarding mental health. So I think it's easier to talk about other issues. Like if you identify a huge issue and say, oh man, like we really need to get on top of mental health, which is true. And then the next thing you say is, but we don't really know what to do. Well, that doesn't really look good for anybody, like policymakers, for example. Not necessarily for the field, although I think generally people are motivated in the field to try and make a difference in what ways we know we can. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to making poor decisions, I think it's something that we all do. And I'll go ahead and say something even more controversial than you said, which is that I don't actually necessarily believe. I think one time we got in an extended argument about this, which started off as a conversation and then it became an argument. I don't fundamentally believe that anybody is really in quote unquote control of what they're doing. Now, I think most of us our nervous systems are primed and capable of healthy behavior, I think is what it comes down to, which can support us and support others, because we're pro-social creatures. But so then when it comes to people that end up in jail, I think their nervous systems are not primed for this type of healthy behavior. They're not capable of reliably healthy behavior. That's what it's down to. I don't think any of us are really fully in control. And the way that we're not in control is different. You and I might not be in control, and yet our nervous systems are capable of running in a way that's smooth with the rest of society, and hopefully for ourselves. People with serious mental illness that end up committing crimes are not in control, and they're not in control in such a way that really winds up bad for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, we won't get too into, rehashing the argument, or else this podcast may go the rest of the day. But no, I do remember the conversation we had, and I think I may be kind of gravitating a little more towards that view. I mean, I guess the way I look at it is like we're all somewhat in control. Like there's the whole, I mean, I think it's a myth, like we use a certain percentage of our brains, and but along somewhat similar lines, I think, say give it let's say there's a number, say 100%, we have 100% control of everything we do, every single action, and I agree with you. I don't think that's possible, because you know I'm sitting here talking to you, but I don't know what's going on in my periphery. I don't know, maybe I could look out the window and see a bird flying by, but I'm not, while I'm talking to you, so we're never like in complete control. I don't think at all. And I think even like someone like me or you who is, I guess I shouldn't speak for myself, but for you, I guess mentally stable enough. I don't know about myself,
I think you're
but
doing okay.
all right, maybe. But say any of us, go out, have a few drinks, maybe a few too many, and you see societal behavior, people do things that are, sometimes when they sober up, they're like, what did I do? Like, is that prefrontal cortex is kind of going offline amongst other stuff. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I guess that even complicates it more, when we talk about that, and as far as like, okay, if someone is intoxicated, or if they are, talk about, like a drug like PCP or something, where, we hear news reports about like crazy stuff, people going out and like eating someone's face off or something, because they're intoxicated off PCP, and that's something like we know that like you use that and you like really do get out of control. But it's like I'm always like thinking, okay, like how do we determine if someone is
messed up enough that they're, quote unquote, like liable, for their own actions. Because maybe they're like, maybe they had, say, let's give it like 90% control, just on a normal sober day, but then, they drink a lot, and then say that control gets down to, let's give it like 55%. Then at 55% of capacity, are they still
Well,
capable of making healthy, healthy
yeah,
nervous
and
system decisions?
I think that's why it's sticky for me to talk about control, and why it doesn't necessarily make that much sense, because we're going back and forth about like percentages, and I don't think that's really actually very scientific. What
Oh yeah,
I
I'm
think
just throwing
what
these numbers
it
out.
comes
I'm not.
to is to first is to then start to think about sentencing, or kind of crime and the legal response, as um, a repercussion rather than punishment. So I think when you get into punishment, then we're talking about like sin, and we're assuming some people are bad people, uh, and that gets into a whole train of thought that's not actually necessarily that productive, and it certainly doesn't align with my worldview, but it also doesn't seem to be aligning with what we know about behavior and science. What makes more sense is to align it with what we know about behavior and science, which is, first of all, you have to disincentivize people by saying, no, this really is, like if you kill somebody, you actually go to jail. Life, you know? There's one, and then the next level is, okay, you committed some crime. Here's a repercussion, so that maybe there can be some learning that happens. And if you really want learning to happen, that means a lot of things for the prison system that have to improve, so you can actually help rehabilitate people to be healthier, better people and live better lives. Um, so that's the second level. And then the third level is recognizing whether somebody is even capable of that degree of learning and growth, because there is a level of damage to the brain, and I can't say, oh, it's at this level, but there is a level of dysfunction that's actually not that capable of behavior, and we even are capable of behavioral change or growth, and we even saw this, uh, much less extent, to a lesser scale, at the place that we used to work at, and that's much accelerated because we're saying, okay, you have to make a notable change in your electrical activity of your brain in the course of 5 days. And it became very clear within 2 days sometimes, and then it would later be confirmed. Yeah, it really does not seem like this person's nervous system is going to be capable of creating a change in that period of time. So that's the other thing that you have to start to factor in is, okay, without making people like a bad person or a good person, circumstances find people where they find people. What's the best response there? There has to be serious consequences for sure when somebody commits a crime, because people have to be disincentivized and people have to do learning. And then once the crime is committed, okay, how can you help facilitate that learning?
What I think would be really interesting, I mean, you brought up a really good point as far as it just made me think, as far as the criminal justice system, it's like it's very much based off, punishment. We're not really, you know, rehabilitating these. Like oftentimes I feel like people, go to jail and it just like hardens them up, it like makes it so they're like they become these like savages that, they get back in normal society and they can't even function because they're like so in that jail mentality or whatever. But what I think would be so interesting is if, someday in the future we, basically like mandated that someone who did something, some heinous crime, like mandated, okay, they have to do neurofeedback. Like they have to learn how to take, more control of their nervous system, if we got to a point where that became reliable enough to be, a therapy to help these kind of people. But I think, taking the neuroscience knowledge we have, I mean, I think it has so many applications, but I would love, have you ever had any conversation with Dr. Adler as far as like what to actually, if there's kind of like what we can actually do as far as sort of rehabilitating these people, like especially the ones that are in jail?
Absolutely. Well, one conversation that he had relevant to me uh, was, of course, going in and doing neurofeedback with people. And then as part of, for example, a defense can say, hey, when we did the first recording, the brain looked like this person's brain looked like this, and their behavior was like this. Then over the course of a few weeks or a few months, in this many sessions of neurofeedback therapy, now the recording is looking like this and their behavior is looking like this. So that's cool. And more importantly, you've helped that person regulate their nervous system better. And I will say, I don't want to go to extremes, because there are things going on in prisons. There are things going on in prisons that are helpful and rehabilitative. There's also, like we were mentioning, there's a lot of like barriers to that. And I think the people that work in prisons have a really difficult job, and they do an amazing job of it. But certainly there's also a fair share of fairly vindictive people that are like not necessarily trying to do the most to help rehabilitate people. And that, I think, comes out of the belief that, yeah, that person is a bad person because they've committed a heinous crime. But even with the people that I have seen like people that have committed these heinous crimes and that have spent time in therapy while in prison, and doing various things and getting different medications, and do seem to be much more capable of healthy behavior. So I won't say that like it doesn't go on at all, but I think there's a perspective shift that could be useful.
That's actually a really cool thing you brought up. It reminds me of like, I mean, I've talked now through my current work, I've talked to a lot of, corrections officers, and a lot of them have actually got very sort of have become very cynical about their work, simply because they see all of the guards around them, treating prisoners with such, disrespect, and there's so much like corruption that often occurs in these prisons, and they're, these people, go in, and I think most people have good intentions, hopefully, and they go in and want to see, uh, these people, as you're saying, at least get, some kind of therapy, get their lives somewhat back in order. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you go in with the perspective of like, okay, I'm a prison guard, I didn't do all of this stuff, I'm a good person, these were bad people, like how can you act in a way that isn't, going to be like condescending and disrespectful to these people?
And perhaps, again, I'm saying this and knowing for a fact I've met some really incredible people that are doing that work.
Absolutely.
But, risk being we all have these like internal biases, and we do various things to kind of reinforce them or kind of fight against them and make ourselves feel better about things. So, for example, the other risk would be that somebody goes into that line of work to make themselves feel better about the ways that they don't feel like they're a good person. And then that becomes an even more volatile situation. And that definitely exists as well. But it's like all things, where humans are involved, you have a mix. Like, it gets messy. You have some really incredible, beautiful, powerful situations, and you have some very small, kind of ugly, mean situations. Mean doesn't do saying just, but I use the word evil because then that gets into saying like right or wrong or good person or bad person.
Right. Okay, so what's like what are people saying, like, people, the judges, juries, people like, who don't have who've never heard of a QEEG before. What is their reaction when, someone like Dr. Adler goes in a courtroom and basically is like, based off what we see in this person's brain, and, the history of fetal alcohol syndrome, this person, based off what we see is not, you know, fully in control of his actions, or however he phrases it. But are people like, oh, this is just some weird mumbo jumbo neuroscience crap that I don't understand? Or are people like, okay, there's real scientific proof, which I mean, I've seen a little bit of it, and it sounds like you're actually doing, research, which is awesome. But what's sort of the public opinion right now?
Sure. Well, I will say as a disclaimer, again, I'm not in the courtrooms, so I'm not seeing people's reactions directly. But from what I know from reading transcripts and just from the state of our work right now, it's a mix. And certainly there's a lot of fight against it of, like the lawyers on the other side of the table will fight against and say exactly what you were saying. They're saying, oh, this isn't valid. This is, there's no precedent for this, which of course is not the case. There is a legal precedent for it. And I think you even see that in like, for example, I've spoken to other psychiatrists that are quite disparaging of QEEG.
Sure.
So it is. I think it has been used unscientifically, and it doesn't necessarily have the most rigorous history, perhaps is a way of putting it. So for something like fMRI is much more respected because there's a level of precision that goes on there, but also because of the way it's been used. It doesn't have the same history of usage with like so many people have gotten their hands on EEG and are able to kind of make statements and be unscientific because they can afford an EEG and all of a sudden they have a scientific tool and they can say, oh yeah, I see this. And they're, maybe they are saying something that they're seeing and maybe it is within one of the frequency bands. And then they generate large sweeping statements of saying like, oh yeah, last time I saw this. And, I think both of us can think of one or two people like that.
Maybe.
That you can start to make sweeping statements that are quite unscientific. So it's definitely an issue. And we need to go very slowly because this is the process of science. It's very important of saying, okay, this is what we do know. And it might just be a little sliver. For example, fetal alcohol syndrome. This is what we do know right now. This is what we can clearly say, yeah, that's an indicator. And we can predict it impacts behavior this way. So let's speak to that. Let's be really strong about the things that we can speak to and also really open about the things that we can't speak to.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, just hearing, kind of that, because this is all, the first time I'm hearing this from you, and it's like, I had a lot of these questions of like, how do you determine, someone's culpability or whatever, but the fact that you guys are doing such a science, approaching this in such a scientific way, I think is definitely, going to benefit, the whole field of sort of that, whatever you want to call it, using the EEG with the criminal justice system. But you bring up a good point that there's probably, I mean, hopefully not as many people, but I'm sure there are people, as you've said, who've got their hands on this and are probably actually doing the field a disservice when they go and, say that, they make certain claims that the other side of the courtroom is going to easily just tear apart because they're unscientific. I think is that a barrier, you think, to like the progression of this sort of?
It's not even that stuff per se makes it into the courtroom, but that is like what has fed a general feeling of EEG or QEEG not being a reliable tool, is like a history of, it's great that EEG is affordable. It's actually quite important. It's going to make it a very important tool going into this next era of mental health, which I hope and it seems that we're moving into. But it's also an issue because then you have, and it's not well regulated. I also can speak to the certification that I have in EEG. It's, I won't say it's easy to get. It's not easy to get, and certainly you need to work with somebody who has the field. But it's not at the level of scientific rigor that like many other things would be.
Are you talking about the BCN?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just did that too, and I would agree with you. I mean, the test was challenging to some degree, I guess, but it's not like going to med school, right?
The only useful part about the whole process is the mentorship. And that then depends on what kind of mentor you get. I mean, the course.
I like the course I did.
It's in there.
Yeah.
But even the course, it's like, hopefully all of that would be covered by a mentor and is recovered by a mentor and is in much more depth with a mentor. So the whole process is basically a mentorship process, in my eyes. And that mentorship process, it depends who you have as a mentor. So, it's like, I think we could do better. I think we could definitely an issue.
Right. I think it comes back down for me to a point I made in the first part of the podcast where, my sort of theory on this, EEG or whatever these neurotechnologies is, it's like, it's just a tool that can be used for good or bad, but it's all about who's actually the one in charge of it. And it's like, you could have some idiot who doesn't know what they're talking about and is actually going to make all of these broad sweeping statements that, aren't, and that's the problem is I think it's so much like, I really do think there's certain people in the field that have so much knowledge and they really are like brilliant, educated people with numerous master's degrees and postdoctorates, but I think it's really those people's sort of almost responsibility to be the ones like getting this information out there. Like I was just reading this textbook. It was like this 600-page textbook on QEEG that I found laying around at my work. But it's like something like that is like no one even told me about that. I just was like looking around my work and happened to find that. Like I feel like that's something like everyone doing this should read.
Right.
But
Right.
but you don't have
Absolutely.
to. Like
No.
I mean that's like it doesn't even take like we don't have to have this BCN to do what we do. We could I don't
Exactly. There's
there
legal,
we wouldn't even have to
have the certificate.
yeah.
Now, fully.
Oh, you do have to
No, no.
legally
No,
okay.
there's not. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Hopefully, respected individuals will require it. Like, for example, I would never be able to have the role that I have now without a BCN. But, right, like, there's certain things that would be very helpful from a legal perspective, too. Like, all of these things kind of need to come in and mesh together. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is there and it's fine if we can't talk about this because I'm sure there's some a lot of confidentiality here, but can you give me any example as far as maybe someone who and not going into specifics or whatever, but can you give me an example of someone that Dr. Adler kind of defended and maybe seeing how their outcome in the legal system sort of improved or at least changed because of some of this work? Is there any particular example you can give me?
I won't go super in depth about it, although it's all public records, so it's not super confidential. But Yeah, there have been people. I think of like level of specificity here. Yeah, I mean, suffice it to say, like maps that I have taken that he's then gone and testified with have actually been weighed, and there was a quote, I think, from a judge during the judge's kind of final breakdown of the trial, that basically was saying, one of the key pieces of evidence here was the QEEG. And that person did not get the death penalty. So there's been various things. Unfortunately, we have done work. I have not done any of my work with somebody that's a school shooter, but I know he has done work with people that have done school shootings. I have done work with people that have, murdered people within their own family. So certainly, like, it is, these are very serious cases, but you also have to think no reasonable, healthy, like, person that's in control at any level of their behavior, or capable of healthy behavior, as another way to say it, would ever do that. I mean, like, it would barely even cross the mind of someone, so that should be an obvious, right? But instead we turn and say, wow, that must be the most horrible varietal person.
Right.
In the most horrible type of distress and so incapable of controlling their behavior. That's not the way we think about it. Instead, we think about it as, wow, that person must be some sort of devil or demon.
Yeah.
But it's like, look, it's like right in front of our eyes. That person is not the person that's the devil. That person is the person that's in hell. So that's, I think, the way that we should look at it.
That's a really good quotable. What you just said right there. That's a tweet right there. I like that.
Damn.
I gotta just ask you, what is it? I'm so curious. What is it like to actually like go and like do you have like a conversation with these people, or like say you are informed of a case and there's some guy that you know killed his family, like you were saying, like what is that like interacting with that person? Like that must be wild.
Yeah. It's sobering. Yeah, I have to say. And I've generally more recently made it my policy to not try to look at the cases beforehand. Certainly, there's information that I need, and if it comes in the email, I'm not like, oh, I can't see that. It's part of the job. But I also don't try to seek out, oh, what did this person do? I go in and I do my job, and I try to do it with kindness also. I try and do it just seeing the person. And often it can be helpful to just see the person if I don't necessarily know what they've done. But if I do know what they've done, I still go in and just try to see the person that's there. And generally, it's a person in a lot of pain. But for example, with this person who kill their family, yeah, that one I did know about before. Actually, that was my first. Work that I did for Dr. Adler. That was the first map
Threw
that I
you
did.
into the deep end.
Yeah, it was intense. And I remember going in, and I spent a few hours with this person, and that it was very sobering. But I think the most impactful part about it, it was like I went into this situation, crazy, like maximum security. It was my first experience, kind of being double fenced in and being like constantly being watched by other people, being escorted. And then and sad this one event in their past about. And it turns out they were actually like a really nice, caring, kind person who had a lot of remorse for what they had done. And many years had passed. So I will say also that this was, in this case, it was an appeal trial, which is not not the bulk of the work. But this was an appeal trial of somebody that had been sentenced to death. And so over a decade later, I think it might have been 2 decades or close to 2 decades later, this person is sitting there feeling a lot of remorse and really aware of what they had done.
Interesting. So you could tell that it was really genuine, that it wasn't just them putting on an act to try to get a lighter sentence.
Well, absolutely, because they know, first of all, that has no impact. Like
Okay.
So they know that also. So
Sure.
it's just a one-on-one interaction. And actually, we didn't even directly speak about it, is the other thing. We kind of skirted around it, around the topic. So at no point were we having an upfront topic about, I was like, oh, how do you feel about the fact that you did that?
Yeah.
No, not at all. But there were kind of conversations that happened around like, oh, my child was kind of like that. And there was like a little, like there was a significant amount of sadness around it. And, I didn't try to broach that topic. I let this person go into it as much as they like and respected what they said about it to me. But there was a clear degree of sobering seriousness around, yeah, this is really what happened. This is not a nightmare. This is not a false reality. Like, I'm not living in something fake. This is something that happened. I did this, and this is the reality that I'm living with now.
Man,
So
that's
that really,
yeah.
that big impression on me.
Yeah, that's got to be fascinating. I mean, just going in there and seeing the kind of stuff you do. Listen, I wanna wrap this up, but I hope that this kind of, people who are listening and watching this, I hope this, at least gets a dialogue going, because
Yeah.
the whole show, I always say it's like this is not like a show where I'm teaching people something. Like, my goal in doing this is, to get a dialogue going about like different things that I tend to be interested in and think are valuable. And I think some of the stuff we said or we talked about is like it's like a paradigm shift in a lot of ways in terms of just viewing mental health and justice reform and neurotechnology in a whole new light. And I mean, I'm obviously fascinated to see, where you go with this and hearing about all the things that end up, going on in your career for however much longer you're doing this kind of work. I think it's going to be, hopefully it's going to really change a lot of people's lives and prevent a lot of suffering.
Well, that's the hope. And I think like the last thing that I'll say is we kind of like we're getting near to this topic earlier, but the one thing that it's really motivated me on is like finding better that we don't really know what we're doing in mental health. We have some hammers, and sometimes there's nails that work. So SSRIs are an example. We used to have no tools, at least from a medicine perspective. We had much better tools from the perspective of taking people from a community and living from a community perspective and living healthier lives. So that was better. But we used to have no tools from a medication perspective. So now we have some tools, but they're not quite as specific as they could be, and we don't quite know as much about them as we could. So this has really opened my eyes to the fact that we're really trying to figure this mental health thing out. Spending is at an all-time high, and levels of depression and anxiety are at an all-time high. 30% of people that are treated in our mental health system for depression, for example, 30% don't even respond to any of the treatments. That's treatment-resistant depression. So we're really at a loss with what to do here. And the people that do respond often have a lot of side effects that are unsavory or that they're not particularly fond of. So current passion, and what I'm hoping to study going forward and on this Fulbright that I've applied for is other ways of coming at mental health that are starting to be more recognized and show a little more promise, but that remain kind of on the outskirts. And one of the big ways is through different classic psychedelics. So that's kind of an interesting area going forward. That could be a whole.
I was just gonna say, man, that's a little teaser. Yeah, I'll absolutely get you back on the show, and yeah, we could do a whole show just kind of centered around those kind of emerging therapies. Yeah, just talk to. What's that?
We'll have a little more of a break before that podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, these two will go together, and I think they go together nicely. So. If you guys did enjoy the show, well, actually, I'll ask does Dr. Adler have any kind of website, or would you direct anyone if they're curious about learning more about the work you're doing, the work he's doing, anywhere they should go?
He has a Twitter, so you could
Okay.
look at his Twitter, Dr. Richard Adler. I don't know his handle, but I'm sure if you look him up that way, you'll find it pretty quick.
Right.
The website it's not really for people that are interested in the work. It's more for clients or people that are looking for us to do this work. So, further resources. Oh, maybe I'll send you some. We can talk about it offline, and I can send you some different books. But no, I'd say yeah, you can check out his Twitter if you like, and yeah, just stay in tune with what's going on with criminal justice system.
Sweet. Maybe we'll put. You said you guys published a paper.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
Maybe I can put that in the show notes.
Totally.
That'd be super cool. Awesome. Well, if you guys enjoyed the show, go follow us on Instagram, Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. We're now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio. So any platform you guys want, it's Roscoe's Wetsuit is the YouTube, and you can just find us through all those other platforms searching Roscoe's Wetsuit. So go like and subscribe, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the show. Thanks so much again, Sam.
Cool. Peace, Toby.